John chapter 11, verse 1 to 44. Now a man named Lazarus was ill. He was from Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. This Mary, whose brother Lazarus now lay ill, was the same one who poured perfume on the Lord and wiped his feet with her hair. So the sisters sent word to Jesus, "Lord, the one you love is ill." When he heard this, Jesus said, "This illness will not end in death. No, it is for God's glory, so that God's Son may be glorified through it." Now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So when he heard that Lazarus was ill, he stayed where he was 2 more days. And then he said to his disciples, "Let us go back to Judea." "But Rabbi," they said, "a short while ago the Jews there tried to stone you, and yet you are going back?" Jesus answered, "Are there not 12 hours of daylight? Anyone who walks in the daytime will not stumble, for they see by the world's light. It is when a person walks at night that they stumble, for they have no light." After he had said this, he went on to tell them, "Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I'm going there to wake him up." His disciples replied, "Lord, if he sleeps, he will get better." Jesus had been speaking of his death, but the disciples thought he meant natural sleep. So then he told them plainly, "Lazarus is dead, and for your sake I am glad I was not there, so that you may believe, but let us go to him." Then Thomas, also known as Didymus, said to the rest of the disciples, "Let us also go, that we may die with him." On his arrival, Jesus found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Now Bethany was less than 2 miles from Jerusalem, and many Jews had come to Martha and Mary to comfort them in the loss of their brother. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him, but Mary stayed at home. "Lord," Martha said to Jesus, "if you had been there, my brother would not have died. But I know that even now God will give you whatever you ask." Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise again." Martha answered, "I know he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day." Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me, even though they die. And whoever lives by the believing in me will never die. Do you believe this?" "Yes, Lord," she replied. "I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, who has come into the world." After she said this, she went back and called her sister Mary aside. "The teacher is here," she said, "and is asking for you." When Mary heard this, she got up quickly and went to him. Now Jesus had not yet entered the village, but was still at the place where Martha had met him. When Jesus, who had been with Mary in the house, comforting her, noticed how quickly she got up and went out, they followed her, supposing she was going to the tomb to mourn there. When Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. "Where have you laid him?" he asked. "Come and see, Lord," they replied. Jesus wept. Then the Jews said, "See how he loved him." But some of them said, "Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying?" Jesus, once more deeply moved, came to the tomb. It was a cave with a stone laid across the entrance. "Take away the stone," he said. "But Lord," said Martha, the sister of the dead man, "by this time there is a bad odour, for he has been there for 4 days." Then Jesus said, "Did I not tell you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God?" So they took away the stone. Then Jesus looked up and said, "Father, I thank you for that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I said this for the benefit of the people standing here, that they may believe that you sent me." When he had said this, Jesus called in a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out!" The dead man came out, his hands and his feet wrapped with strips of linen, and a cloth round his face. Jesus said to them, "Take off the grave clothes and let him go."
Good morning. Over the past few months, we've been lucky enough to hear some new voices, and it is both amazing and intimidating to be part of the same experiment myself. I've never preached before, and so I hope today isn't too painful. I'll be focusing on "Love always perseveres." This particular line stood out to me from the others, simply because it took me the longest time to understand how vital it is that true love endures. If someone had asked me when I was in my teens how I saw love, I'd have probably replied with exciting or passionate. It brought to mind the stories I'd read of forbidden love and secret affairs, which to my teenage self was love. Do any of these iconic couples look familiar? I know I was massively influenced by how Hollywood showed love, believing they're nothing more romantic than meeting the one, falling head over heels and living happily ever after. Did any of you feel the same? More besotted with the idea of love than anything else? I can see now that love isn't just what we see in rom-coms. Not that there's anything wrong with that, of course. Also, I have to confess I am still keeping my fingers crossed for an epic romance myself someday. But at least now I know that at love's best, it's so much more. So what story stood out to me? What passage from Scripture felt like it captured the depths of persevering love? As Steph read, I chose the resurrection of Lazarus. Perhaps not a passage that immediately comes to mind when thinking about love, but I know it's definitely one of the more well-known stories. The story begins when Jesus hears that his good friend Lazarus is sick, and he hears this news from his sisters, Mary and Martha. "Lord, the one you love is sick." And he replies, "This sickness will not end in death. No, it is for God's glory, so that God's Son may be glorified through it." After 2 days had passed, Jesus declares to his disciples that they are returning to Judea, but one speaks up. "But Rabbi, a short while ago the Jews there tried to stone you, and yet you are going back." It would have been understandable if Jesus had not returned. To go back to a place where the people hated you and endeavoured to kill you hardly sounds like the most sensible decision. Can you imagine how frightening it would be? Yet he doesn't seem scared. Maybe the first example within this passage that highlights the persistence of real love, even in fear. Let me ask you a question. Would you go back to a dangerous place for someone? Would you return to where people hated you and might even want to hurt you for someone you loved? In your mind, silently, can you think of someone you would risk getting hurt for? For Jesus, on this day, that person is Lazarus. He says this, "Are there not 12 hours of daylight? Anyone who walks in the daytime will not stumble, for they see by this world's light. It is when a person walks at night that they stumble, for they have no light." He goes on to tell them that Lazarus is sleeping and he is going to wake him up, but his disciples don't understand. Jesus had been speaking of his death, but his disciples thought he meant natural sleep, and so he clarifies. "Lazarus is dead, and for your sake I am glad I was not there, so that you may believe, but let us go to him." It's easy to hear his exasperation in this passage, yet he also loves them enough to try and teach them. However, Thomas isn't wholly convinced. "Let us also go, that we may die with him." Let us also go, that we may die with him. At a glance, this can be seen as highlighting Thomas's disbelief in Jesus, and may be open to criticism, and yet I can't help but be touched. Thomas thinks the people of Judea will attempt, and may even succeed in killing Jesus, and still he is willing to follow him. Let me repeat that. Thomas is willing to follow Jesus, even if it means his own death. It's easy to condemn Thomas for his doubt, but speaking personally, I know I definitely wouldn't be keen to return to Judea in this situation. But if someone I loved asked me to follow them, would I go? Again, let me ask, can you think of someone you would follow into danger? Have you ever loved someone enough to go with them or along with their plans, even if you had doubts? Or perhaps have you ever been on the other side, sure of your path, yet someone you loved wasn't so convinced but followed you regardless? Despite Thomas's misgivings, Jesus and the disciples arrive, and Martha, the sister of Lazarus, goes out to meet him. If you had been here, my brother would not have died. Not the warmest greeting, and certainly not carrying the same immediate wonder Jesus is often greeted with. And yet Martha has just lost her brother. But is this actually blame? And if it is that wrong? Would any of us not say the same thing if we met Jesus while in the depths of grief? Yet her strength of faith follows. But I know that even now, God will give you whatever you ask. She still trusts that Jesus is truly the Messiah, even while in the throes of mourning. Jesus says to her, "Your brother will rise again." Martha believes he refers to the resurrection at the last day, but instead of correcting her, he says this: "I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live, even though they die, and whoever lives by believing in me will never die." Martha returns home and tells her sister the teacher is here, and Mary goes to Jesus. Unknowingly, she parallels her sister, falling at his feet, saying, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." Again, the harsh grief in this repeated line is real. Yet what is grief but love with nowhere to go? Mary's love for her brother hasn't been stopped by his death, because I believe everyone here knows that death does not end love. But this time, with Mary, Jesus doesn't talk of resurrection or of faith. Instead, it says this: "He was deeply moved in spirit and troubled." "Where have you laid him?" he asked. Now perhaps he is speaking from wisdom. He can see Mary is not in a place to understand his teachings. He knows there is a time for lessons and that this is not one of them. Yet another view is that perhaps Jesus himself is struggling now, and Mary is providing the opportunity for him to grieve. "Where have you laid him?" "Come and see," they replied. Jesus wept. He wept. The Messiah, God in flesh, cried with grief. He mourned. How shatteringly human. I wonder if Mary's open show of emotion perhaps allowed Jesus to express his, to not be a wise teacher, but to openly grieve his friend. Some of the people watching see Jesus crying. "See how he loved him," they say. But others are less moved. Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying? It's a fair question, and one asked earlier by both sisters. Jesus had proven he was capable of miracles and healing the suffering of many. And Jesus loved Lazarus, loved him enough to return to Judea and risk being killed by the people, loved him enough to openly weep. So why didn't he stop Lazarus from dying? I believe it's a lesson in love. When you love someone the way Jesus loved Lazarus, or the way you love the person you thought of earlier, it doesn't mean you can stop bad things from happening to them. No matter how much we want to, you can't protect them from sickness, from injury, or even from death. Loving someone doesn't protect against loss as much as we would like it to, but it means enduring through the hurt. It's the risk, the price. By loving someone, we are vulnerable to the pain of losing them. Yet this, to me anyway, seems fair. For what is grief compared to the overwhelming joy that comes with love? But back to the story. Jesus and the sisters arrive at the tomb of Lazarus, and he instructs them to roll away the stone. Martha, both faithful and practical, hesitates. By this time there is a bad odour, for he has been there 4 days. Jesus replies, "Did I not tell you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God?" The stone is removed. Then Jesus looked up and said, "Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I said this for the benefit of the people standing here, that they may believe that you sent me." He knows. He has perfect trust in his Father, and yet for the sake of those around him, for the grieving sisters and doubting disciples, he speaks aloud. A message to those at the tomb, yes, but I also believe it's a message to us, standing here today. His words coming through time to promise that God always hears us, when we're in love, when we're in grief, when we doubt and when we believe, we are heard by him. Jesus called in a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out." He calls the name of his friend, the man he wept for, the man he grieved for, the man he risked his own safety for. The dead man came out, his hands and feet wrapped with strips of linen and a cloth around his face. Jesus said to them, "Take off the grave clothes and let him go." Take off the grave clothes because Lazarus is alive. So why this story? Because I believe it perfectly illustrates that true love perseveres. When you love someone, that love can't be stopped by death. And from another angle, anyone who is loved can never truly die. Our time may be limited in this world, but love is not. Death and grief are painful and can feel worse than any physical wound. Even while knowing Lazarus would be brought back, Jesus still wept because even the temporary separation was painful. But this story, and so much of Scripture, shows that death cannot stop love. Personally, I believe one day we will be reunited with those that have passed. Even while the veil separates us from them today, nothing can stop us from loving those we've lost. Even while, like Jesus knew, the temporary separation would be painful, distance of any nature does not diminish true love. And while the sisters grieved, Martha in particular, her faith was never shaken. She loved the Lord, through the grief and through the blame. Another beautiful example of love persevering. It is perhaps easier to love God when everything is going well, but what about when everything falls apart? When the one you love is taken from you? No matter the parting isn't forever, it hurts. It's natural to feel that pain, and even Jesus cried in grief. When emotions become as unwieldy as the ocean, a loving faith can be the immovable rock in which they crash against. God can take your pain, your anger, and your hurt, and do so without judgment. So what does the story of Lazarus have to do with us, standing here today? I believe, while society has changed, how even the world itself has transformed from the time of Lazarus, love has remained the same. Through everything, genuine love perseveres, as it did then, does now, and will continue to do forever. It's there when you wake up, through every bad day, and doesn't lessen with any sleepless night. What took me a while to understand is that while roller coaster romances can be thrilling, if it never deepens beyond excitement, it can fizzle out when the novelty wears off. Yet I believe genuine love, persevering love, is different. It's the rock, standing in the midst of the ocean, battered on all sides yet unmoved. It's consistent, even when other emotions are threatening to drown us. Love is at the centre, untouched. But how does God fit into all this? Through reading, I found the phrase, "His love endures," is repeated over 90 times. 90 times. Endures is a brutal sort of description for the wonder of divine love, and yet I believe it's entirely fitting. No matter what, no matter where we go or what we do, the mistakes we make in which we feel there is no coming back from, his love endures. Through every moment of weakness and bad decision, for when we praise his name and when we curse it, when we choose the righteous path or are led astray, his love endures. A reminder that there is nothing we can do to change it, because his love for us will endure forever. And what's more, the story of Lazarus promises us that not even death can stand between us and God's love. So if even death is not enough to separate us, there truly is nothing we can do that will deter him from loving us. When I was a child, and being annoying, hard to picture I know, my mum always used to say that while she may not like the things I did, she would never stop loving me. And what a wonderful way of explaining persevering love. And it made me wonder, does God see us in the same way? Maybe we make mistakes, and perhaps we don't do what he wants us to do, and yet his love for us will never waver. I believe, as well as a promise, it's also encouragement, an aspirational nudge to remind us that the truest core of love is resilience. To mirror him, we too must try and love one another with a rock-steady strength. Yet we must also be gentle with ourselves. We are not God. Our love, unlike his, can falter and fluctuate, but I believe the desire, the wanting, is the most important part. Communion is a wonderful example of starting again, a time to remember that just trying can mean everything. To come back to the table even if you feel as if you've strayed, in the same way that while our imperfect love can waver, we can always come together again. For as long as we want our love to endure, that is what matters most. And the best part, we don't have to do it alone. Love is relational. It exists in the spaces between us all, both as individuals who can promise an enduring love, through sickness and health for richer and poorer to stand by that person's side. Yet we can also aspire to be a church of persevering love. Through life's trials, it can be hard to support anyone every day, especially if you yourself are struggling. I know I've definitely struggled with consistency in love when I felt personally overwhelmed. But we aren't alone, are we? As a church, we can strive towards creating a culture of constant love to make sure no one person ever feels burdened. We can share the gift, the promise, the desire of love enduring. Thank you for listening.